You ready? All right. All right. Hi, everyone. Today is Thursday, October 8th. Another session of American Public Policy Redux. Quite a week it's been for politics here in the United States, especially compared to where we left off in our conversation last week. So I'm sure we'll get to that, but just a reminder for tonight's session that it is recorded in active speaker mode. So even you're on mute, but if you do unmute yourself and you do speak, that you will be recorded and placed in the recording that's on Pat's YouTube channel. If you would not like to be recorded, but certainly would like to contribute to the conversation or have a question, please feel free to chat, either me privately or chat in the chat box to everyone. And if there's time, I'll certainly provide that as well, without name, of course. And then also Pat and I were talking about tonight's session, and he's going to start by presenting a bit of information up front, but he's asked that everyone remain an active listener. So if there is something that you don't understand, a concept he's presented you've never heard before, or want him to provide additional examples for, please feel free to unmute yourself, ask away, and then at the end of his spiel, he will be giving time for additional questions and comments.
My spiel, huh?
Think of another word. So that's all I've got, and Pat, it's all yours.
All right. I'm gonna start out. Michelle knows about this, but I thought that I would share it with you as well before we get into this session. Y'all are going to be famous soon. Well, I outed you, so I thought that it would be good in terms of sort of the college portraying itself, sort of a public relations kind of thing, to do a story about, the session that we're doing together, these sessions we're doing together. And folks got very excited in a number of places, over in alumni relations, the woman who's in charge of the Courier, the provost of the college. The provost wants to do a story about this and have it on her webpage. And they're in the process of doing an article for the online Courier. And I outed Michelle as the person who got this organized. So now she's got to be interviewed. But here's what I want you to think about. This isn't to start a discussion. This is to give you an opportunity to start thinking about it. The person doing the article for the Courier wanted to know about access to the videos that are on my YouTube channel. Nobody, no one, I'm not that popular. No one's going to stumble onto anything on my YouTube channel. Not even my wife and I doing the tango. Okay? And so I would like all of you to think about the degree to which we would like to open up or restrict access in terms of informing folks about those videos. And one avenue is you can put your fate in Michelle's and my hands, and anybody who, in the article they can say, if you're interested in this, you can ask to become a member of that Facebook group page, and then they'll have access to that. Okay, so just give that some thought, and maybe send, excuse me, Michelle and or me an email with your thoughts on that, and we can move forward on that. Does that make sense to everybody? I'll take that for a yes. Okay. I decided to move into the area of partisan polarization, the development of partisan polarization, the nature of partisan polarization, because all of our discussions about factors that have changed the policymaking process from the old system to what we have now kept returning to the role of partisan polarization. So that even though campaign finance was a factor that people really wanted to discuss, even when we started discussing it, we kept bringing in partisan polarization. So I thought I would acknowledge the 600-pound gorilla and deal with that now, since so much revolves around partisan polarization. So what I'm going to do tonight is to talk about the beginnings of partisan polarization, and also, because I don't mind poking fun at my own profession, how political scientists really, I think, including myself, got it wrong about the role that parties play in democratic rule. So I think those are the two things that are important, and also because, and also hitting that business about how political scientists got it wrong, to, in some sense, balance a little bit. Perhaps it's a contrasting argument to the way that I think all of us now think about partisan polarization. So it'll give you a different point of view on partisan polarization by some really, really smart political scientists, including my dissertation advisor. Okay, so I actually want to, I've kind of changed my mind about how I want to do this. I actually want to start out with that. I posted a PDF file with the document. It was an incredibly influential, important essay written by a committee within the American Political Science Association. And if you look at the people who were on that committee, they were the most influential folks in the discipline when it came to American politics. Big, big names. There were some minor differences of opinion on some of the conclusions, but it was an incredibly influential report. And it's that PDF file. The article is Toward a More Responsible Two-Party System. Okay, and I think I simply put up their introduction, summary, something like that. The whole report is very long, but you'll get the gist if you look at if you were able to open the PDF file and take a look at it. So let me kind of lay out the context of that. They're writing, it's in 1950. So in terms of the political parties, they're dealing with a situation that looks markedly different from what we face. Key elements involve the fact that within the Democratic Party, you have the segregationist Southern Democrats, okay, who were so often not aligned with the Democrats, but rather aligned with the Republicans, that Congressional Quarterly, if you look at the yearbooks from the Congressional Quarterly, at the back, they'll do studies of voting behavior, roll call voting behavior in Congress. And they would have the vote broken down by party. And then they would have the vote broken down by Democrats and then the conservative coalition, which consisted of those Southern Democrats plus the Republicans. Okay? And you also had, for comparison to the current situation, remarkably liberal Republicans. So you had a real breadth within the Republican Party, a real range in terms of where folks were coming from, and you had a schism within the Democratic Party between the Northern Democrats and the Southern Democrats. Okay? So I think you can kind of see where this thing is going to go. These are largely pretty liberal dudes who were writing this report. And the Southern Democrats, outside of the South, nobody had much use for the Southern Democrats. Nobody at that point in time outside the Deep South wanted to say that segregation was a great thing. And these political scientists could see that the existence of the Southern Democrats stood in the way of the passage of civil rights legislation, which they correctly saw as crucial, absolutely crucial. Not politically, in a kind of narrow strategic political sense, but rather in a moral sense. It was really important to pass civil rights legislation. And the Southern Democrats kept standing in the way. And they effectively stood in the way because of rules of seniority in the House and the Senate, and deference to committee chairs. So the safest districts in the nation were in the Deep South. So they could run over and over and over. And they were, if you looked at committee chairs around that time, and particularly key committee chairs who were in charge of dealing with legislation having to do with civil rights, those were Southern Democrats. And as the chats keep going on, old and white and male. So when those political scientists were looking at that situation, they saw harm to democratic rule emanating from both party situations. That harm accrued to the Democrats because of the schism in the party, and they had to deal with those segregationist Southern Democrats. Harm to the Republican Party in that the party didn't have a coherent vision, and you would often see it reflected in popular observations that that voters were faced with a choice between Tweedledum and Tweedledee, that the parties didn't offer clearly distinct alternatives. So they just do the simple kind of process of democratic rule thing there. You want voters to perceive a clear difference between the parties so that they can choose to vote for that party which best represents their positions on issues. Well, often you didn't have a terribly clear choice between those alternatives, particularly at the national level. And that's really what they're concerned about. And so they wanted to argue, I'm sorry, let me sort of run that whole process out. So you want voters, you want to make it easier for voters to make that comparative choice, remembering that voters don't pay attention to politics that much. You need to have pretty clear, easily understood differences between the parties, okay? They would then make those choices. The majority party, and this is remarkably naive given what we're now going through, in all likelihood, if a party had majority support in the country, that party would probably control the House and the Senate and the presidency. I want you to see why the report generated some disagreement. That's not what the framers had in mind. Right? The framers were looking for, they wanted to make it difficult for tyranny to occur. Well, the APSA is then saying, well, you know, if you're going to have democracy, you really want unified control of the institutions of government. So you had some folks who believed that the framers had it right and found the APSA report troubling. Okay, but in that context, those really prominent scholars kind of carried the day. The nation had struggled to do anything about civil rights legislation, you know, continued to struggle for over a decade after that with doing anything at all. And you could see some problems with democratic rule if voters really didn't have much to choose between, okay? So that's how it was supposed to work according to, and this is called the responsible parties model, sort of named after that report. They're facing a different situation than we face. And, you know, you can be generous to them and say they would have no idea that it could reach the proportions that we now witness. But it isn't a compelling argument. It's a really compelling argument. And by the way, it calls for straight ticket voting too, because everything needs to be simplified or you're not going to get effective communication. You need to see everything going on in politics in terms of communication. The party needs to communicate clearly where they stand to the voter. Okay? So you want to look at things like party platforms. The voter needs to communicate clearly to elected officials which party alternative they prefer. If I split my ticket, I'm saying, I support this. Oh yeah, and I also support this other alternative, which are supposed to be distinct from one another. So that communication is confused. It's like they're telling you stop and go at the same time. Okay, you need to give legislators a clear message about what you want them to do. And because you have what political scientists have called the one vote, many issues problem, you don't get to pick which issues. They're all out there and nobody knows which issue or issues you considered when you made your choice. So you're making a general communication, but it's clear if you vote a straight ticket. Okay? That's an abbreviated version of this thing on responsible party model that I did in a number of different classes, but does anybody have any questions about that? Okay.
This may be jumping ahead, but
No, it's okay. Go ahead, Ann.
is that just, I mean, and I'm guilty of not reading this beforehand.
No, I put it up late, Hannah. That's okay.
So it seems to be quite like a two-party assumption versus
Yeah.
independence and things like that, where a split ticket would make more sense. Because especially right now, I'm thinking, okay, like you could vote for or against like President Trump or Biden.
Mm-hmm.
That's a pretty distinct difference, whereas more on your local level, you may not agree. You know, I didn't know if they accounted for independents or like third parties at all.
There are like two things you're raising there, okay? One of them is, in a sense, they could care less what you're doing at the state and local level. You know, the civil rights legislation wasn't an issue at that level. So it's really just focusing on your vote for House, Senate, presidency, okay? And the whole logic behind the party platform is that everybody stands on that platform, right? So if I'm the Democrat and I'm running in this House district, I need to be conducting fundamentally, basically, the same kind of issue campaign that my party's presidential candidate does. So again, I'm not obscuring the message that's getting across to voters. States and local think that that's different. And yeah, so you just kind of leave that aside and you can do whatever the hell you want there. And they don't want to deal with extraordinary circumstances where, you know, I'm a straight up Republican, but I can't vote for that dude. It was rare that you would have it's rare that you would have those kinds of situations at the national level where you would get a candidate so profoundly incompetent. You're talking about personal traits then, right?
Yeah, I think personal traits, and sometimes, which to me it seems like is becoming more prominent over the years, like personal traits over policy traits. But
it's always no. We're not any better or worse. It's always been personal traits.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I think part of it would probably be personal traits then versus policy.
Yeah. And if pressed, Jerry Pomper, my dissertation advisor, there are a number of things on which we disagree when we're looking at voting behavior and this kind of thing, but on this one, we're kind of one mind. And that is, if you're a Republican and you found one of your party's candidates to lack key personal traits so profoundly that you couldn't vote for them, then you just don't vote in that election and for that office. Okay. Let me through, because this is a sort of finer detail of this. Candidates pay attention to what's called drop off. Okay. So if in this county, 400,000 votes are cast for 200,000 votes are cast for president. And then you look at the number of votes cast in the county in the House race, and it's 100,000. Then you know that one or both of the candidates was really negatively regarded by folks in that district. Because I mean, I've had conversations with candidates, they notice that drop off. So when you say, I'm a Republican, but I can't vote for you, that information actually kind of, if there are enough people like that, that information gets back to them, and makes a difference in terms of folks' behavior. When it comes to independents really don't have any role to play here. If you think about it, if you're an independent, you can't communicate anything. There's no independent platform. You know, like, right? You can't do that. So independents really don't play any role in democratic rule. They'll kind of shift back and forth. They may shift back and forth between the parties. In a sense, maybe that's good news for democratic rule, maybe not. And the third party thing, there's so many structural factors that make it difficult for third parties to win, that it's not really something that you would seriously try to entertain. in terms of, I'll put it in different terms, in terms of actually my dissertation. You can think about third parties as way stations. Okay, so if you looked at historical records from party conventions, periodically leadership in the party or a new presidential candidate will change what the party stands for or refuse to change what the party stands for. Think about times like the Civil War, or, well, antebellum, okay? Right before the Civil War, think about Great Depression. There are a couple other points in time. And if you read the historical records, lots of times it's really great in the really old ones because they'll have their convention, the party will have its convention in a hotel, and then the rebel faction who just can't stand where the party is going will march out of the convention, cross the street, go to the hotel on the other side of the street, and they will say things like, the Democratic Party, as I've known it, is dead. So you're talking about what we call a party realignment. Well, lots of times they form a third party when they go across the street. So that becomes a way station. They're leaving the Democratic Party, they're going on this third party, and in time, the Republican Party says, we can count votes. We're going to embrace those things that this third party presented as reasons to leave the Democrats so we can attract them over to our party and start winning elections. Maybe we're losing before. Now we can win elections. So it becomes a kind of strategic thing to take advantage of those schisms within the party. And that's kind of what you're going to see with the Southern Democrats as we lead from the 50s, 60s, and onward. Does that make sense? That may be more than you really wanted.
Okay, I tend to ask those kind of questions, so it's fine.
No, that's great. That's great. Okay, I think that wraps up the responsible party model thing that I wanted to do. So there were plenty of political scientists who wanted to see this kind of transition where the parties presented clearer, more distinct alternatives. Well, if you have a chance to read the Barbara Deckard Sinclair, you're not going to read the whole book just yet. She was, I think I posted, she was my intro American politics professor. She was just out of graduate school and her first teaching gig was at University of California, Riverside, where I spent my freshman year. And then years later, when I'd gotten into the discipline, I walked into an elevator with Barbara Deckard Sinclair. Now, but this is UC Riverside. So the class was like hundreds and hundreds of people. And even though I sat in the front row every day because I was a geek, she didn't notice me. So I kept my mouth shut. I didn't say, yeah, you were my intro American politics bro. She became one of the most prominent scholars of Congress in the country. When I was teaching the Reagan class, I told students in the class, this is the best book you're going to read all year. Her scholarship is really, really good. She writes really well and she thinks clearly about this. So if and when you get a chance, I highly recommend the book. It got to the point for folks who graduated more recently, honestly, political science books got published, got crummier, particularly for teaching undergraduates. And so I increasingly found it difficult to highly recommend books that I was using in class. I would find myself apologizing a lot of the time. You know, I know this sucks, but it's the best thing we can do right now. The good stuff has gone out of print. This is a great book. This is real. It's really, really well done. Okay. And we're looking at that first when we're dealing with partisan polarization, because I'm going to make a reference to another work that I mentioned earlier in the series, John Zoller's book on public opinion. Made a very persuasive argument, provided really persuasive evidence that opinion formation moves from elites down to the mass public, which should make sense given the way that we understand the public's general lack of interest in politics and consequent lack of knowledge. And that the president occupies the key role in terms of sort of framing issues and the way you would think about an issue for ordinary citizens. So if we're looking at partisan polarization, we look first at the elites and then move, I got it there. The name of the author, actually he has an article that would be quicker to read. It's John Zoller, it's Zaller. The easiest thing to do is to just do a Google Scholar search for John Zoller, and you're going to come across this book was written a few decades ago. It is one of the most important and influential books written by a political scientist in the last few decades. It's really, really important. And for being a data-driven kind of thing, I think it's pretty readable. All right. Barbara Decker Sinclair starts out her book with a puzzle. And the puzzle puts together two dates, 1964 and 1980. Okay? All right. So who's the Republican nominee for president in 1964? And Michelle doesn't get, no, that would be cheating, Michelle. Anybody? You get a half point if you identify the Democrat. 1964. Do I have to pull back all of your diplomas? What? Nobody? You're killing me.
I think of Hillary Clinton when I think of the answer.
Yeah, it's long.
She said she was
many moons before. Hannah?
Oh, moon
Goldwater, right?
Goldwater.
Oh, okay.
Did you cheat, you lousy dog? Did you?
Well, I thought Goldwater, and then I fact checked it before I said it. So.
So you get a half point. You get a half credit for this.
It's gonna be on the internet. I gotta check.
So Barry Goldwater, and the easier one, 1980, Republican nominee.
Reagan.
Ronald Reagan. It's been a long time since I've been able to do my Ronald Reagan impression, so you'll have to forgive me. It's a little rusty. I haven't. Okay.
So y'all need to watch Mrs. America. That'll get you all caught up in all the presidents from 63 or 2 to like 80.
It was
There you
awesome.
go.
I loved
Yeah.
it. It was awesome.
All right. So here's the puzzle. Do you know what happened in the 1964 election? Goldwater's running against
Lyndon Johnson.
Lyndon Baines Johnson. Leaving aside the Electoral College, which at that point in time really even more than now, really exaggerates the margin of victory. Goldwater had more than 60% of the popular vote. He buried Goldwater, just absolutely destroyed Goldwater. It was one of those, I mean, I was just a little kid, but I remember a certain embarrassment in saying that you supported Barry Goldwater. okay? Barry Goldwater, you understand, this is coming out of the era of Eisenhower, okay? And then Nixon being an unsuccessful candidate in 1960, okay? Eisenhower got recruited by both parties to run for president. So Eisenhower is not this really wild conservative, okay? In fact, he was kind of a blank slate. You know, he's a military guy. Both parties want to win. He came out of World War II, tremendously popular, okay? So they both kind of fought over him, and he ended up with the Republican Party. But that doesn't speak to moving the Republican Party to the right, okay? And, you know, y'all are okay if I beat up on Richard Milhouse Nixon. Okay. Nixon was just an opportunist. He didn't have really strong issue positions. Whatever was going to gain him some power, he would move in that direction. So later on, when he's president, he signs environmental protection legislation in the wake of the environmental movement. He's all over the place. So you don't have a really, really conservative Republican Party until Barry Goldwater, okay? So we're now you're gonna, this will be a glimpse into the past in a number of ways. First of all, it's a 1964 political ad, so it's black and white, okay? It is also, I mean, how long are campaign ads now? 30 seconds? Got that? This is a few minutes long, okay? So you're gonna have to bear with us. This speaks to the drastically abbreviated attention span of folks watching TV now, okay? But so bear with me. Let's put that there, and there, and share. Okay, does everybody see the ad? Okay. Again, bear with me. You can see it on the bottom. It's 4 minutes long, okay?
I don't know just why they
come
want
on.
to call this a confession. I certainly don't feel guilty about being a Republican. I've always been a Republican. My father is, his father was. The whole family is a Republican family. I voted for Dwight Eisenhower the first time I ever voted. I voted for Nixon the last time. But when we come to Senator Goldwater, now it seems to me we're up against a very different kind of a man. This man scares me. Now, maybe I'm wrong. A friend of mine has said to me, listen, just because a man sounds a little irresponsible during a campaign doesn't mean he's going to act irresponsibly. You know that theory that the White House makes the man. I don't buy that. You know what I think makes a president? I mean, aside from his judgment, his experience, the men behind him, his advisors, the cabinet. And so many men with strange ideas are working for Goldwater. You hear a lot about what these guys are against. They seem to be against just about everything, but what are they for? The hardest thing for me about this whole campaign is to sort out one Goldwater statement from another. A reporter will go to Senator Goldwater and he'll say, Senator, on such and such a day, you said, and I quote, blah, 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 whatever it is, end quote. And then Goldwater says, well, I wouldn't put it that way. I can't follow that. Was he serious when he did put it that way? Is he serious when he says he wouldn't put it that way? I just don't get it. A president ought to mean what he says. President Johnson, now, Johnson at least is talking about facts. He says, look, we got...
And now pulling out a cigarette in the middle.
to carry home X number of dollars more every payday. We got the nuclear test ban, and because of that, there's X% less radioactivity in the food. But Goldwater, well, often you can't, I can't figure out just what Goldwater means by the things he says. I read now where he says, a craven fear of death is sweeping across America. What is that supposed to mean? If he means that people don't want to fight a nuclear war, he's right. I don't. When I read some of these things that Goldwater says about total victory, I get a little worried, you know? I wish I was as sure that Goldwater is against war as I am that he's against some of these other things. I wish I could believe that he has the imagination to be able to just shut his eyes and picture what this country would look like after a nuclear war.
So it'll be what, the 19th is the first day. I can show up anytime they want. Thanks, Denise.
Sometimes I wish I'd been at that convention in San Francisco. I mean, I wish I'd been a delegate. I really do, because I would have fought, you know? And I wouldn't have worried so much about party unity, because if you unite behind a man you don't believe in, it's a lie. I tell you, those people who got control of that convention, who are they? I mean, when the head of the Ku Klux Klan, when all these weird groups come out in favor of the candidate of my party, either they're not Republicans or I'm not. I thought about just not voting in this election, just staying home, but you can't do that, because that's saying you don't care who wins, and I do care. I think my party made a bad mistake in San Francisco, and I'm going to have to vote against that mistake on the 3rd of November.
Vote for President Johnson.
There you go. So let me fill some of that. I thought it was a really cool ad, and the length of it really is striking. Like, nobody would sit through an ad that long now.
Who is that? Is it just a random individual? I didn't catch.
Oh yeah, it's an actor.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, it's an
He
actor.
did great. Wow.
Yeah. If you go to the page where that thing is there are all kinds of, it's a little bit like commenting on the fly on Mike Pence's head. So everybody's talking about the cigarette. So let me lay out the things that were that they alluded to. Goldwater talked pretty openly about the wisdom of conducting a nuclear strike in Vietnam to resolve the situation there. That was the reference to the craven fear of death. And he was remarkably libertarian, like wildly libertarian. I want you to put it in the context. You're not that far removed from the Great Depression. For most Americans, the Great Depression had completely delegitimized a libertarian approach. You didn't get out of the Great Depression by letting the free market operate. You only got out of the Great Depression through strong governmental action. You know, and the way that it was understood was a strong governmental action that countered some pathologies of the market. And yet, you know, 30 years later, this guy is saying we need to just get rid of. We just need to get rid of, we need to have the smallest government we can possibly have. And there was certainly anti-communism, but his anti-communism like really went off the deep end, which is saying a lot because anti-communism was really strident, honestly, in both parties, but he was out there. Here's the thing that's striking. If I go through an awful lot of those policy positions of Barry Goldwater, your generation won't have nearly the problems with them that the voters did in 1964. Here's the last part of the puzzle. Because Ronald Reagan, 16 years later, comes back taking a lot of the same positions and wins. Do you get the sharp reversal. That's Barbara Deckard Sinclair's puzzle. How in the world did that happen? And so what I thought to kind of finish up things tonight, what I wanted to do was to go through the ways in which Ronald Reagan changed both the policy positions and the constituency of the Republican Party in ways that got partisan polarization going, okay? And a great deal of getting partisan polarization going is making things more ideological, okay? In terms of, to start out, I want to correct a sort of popular sense of things. Reagan didn't so much win in 1980 as Carter lost. Carter was just a very weak candidate. He had good timing running in 1976 because he portrayed himself as possessing just a remarkable level of integrity. And that's in the wake of Richard Milhous Nixon, the antithesis of integrity, okay? The country was in really bad economic shape. You had both high levels of unemployment and high levels of inflation, which wasn't supposed to ever occur, according to most economic theory. We don't want to exaggerate the degree to which the public embraced something that in 1964 they thought was repellent. Okay, the public did have real reservations about Ronald Reagan, but once in the White House, Reagan did a remarkably good job of then legitimating the very similar kind of policy program to the one espoused by Barry Goldwater just 16 years earlier, okay? And for starters, he combined two groups that at the time you wouldn't really think about putting together. And that's the free market groups, free market folks, you know, the respected pillars of the community, and the Christian right. Okay? If you think about it, those two sets of individuals often don't have much in common. Okay? And in a sense, you can take a look at, you know, we're now 40 years removed from that, and you can often see very, very odd things happening within the Republican Party between representatives of those two groups. No, I'm not going to go. I'm not going to go down that road. Oh, yes, I am. Liberty University. Okay. A real institution of the Christian right. They hand governance of the university over to more of a free market guy who really, morality, not really an important part of his life. You know, Franklin, no. But he was going to set it on a good financial footing. So then you have a situation that for evangelicals, it's really uncomfortable because this guy clearly is not a moral person. It's not a hard question. And he's running your flagship university, okay? But one of the amazing things Ronald Reagan did was to start to bring those two groups together into the same party. To hit the free market folks first, what Ronald Reagan did was to take sort of the old version of this was coming through the Chicago school with Milton Friedman. and then go off the deep end. Milton Friedman, fairly well-respected economist, whether you agree or disagree with him, he's sort of a popular economist, but he's at least competent. But there were two like fringe folks in the discipline who were really not respected by most economists, Jude Wanniski and Arthur Laffer, and Reagan embraced their theories. And their theories kind of led to the supply side tax cuts that you saw, okay, in 1981 and 1986. And that supply side approach to economics, it now forms the center of the Republican Party. There's one thing that they can all agree on, okay? Whether it works or not, in some sense, doesn't matter. That's become something that could really pull the party together. And I think you can find a reference to that supply side approach to economics in every Republican Party platform until you get to Donald Trump. Okay. The really important thing that's going to drive an awful lot of our discussion was Reagan pulling the Christian right into the party. And getting a handle on this will require that you imagine a very different world than the one in which you have lived. And in that world, precisely those groups that were in the Christian right didn't want to get connected to politics at all, because they saw getting entangled in politics and politics all of a sudden addressing issues of religion as really, really dangerous, because they were in the minority and they lacked power. The Protestant sects connected to folks in power were high status Protestant, not low status Protestant. And the Christian right was low status Protestant. It's like Southern Baptists, okay? They feared that they would face discrimination if all of a sudden religious issues tied to religion, started cropping up in politics. For folks studying the beginning of the Republic, that should have some resonance, right? It's why they come here. Reagan changes that by embracing the Christian right and giving them immediate access to the White House. Once they have power, all of a sudden, politics looks pretty good to them. Yeah, I am going to call it hypocritical. That's just, it just is. You can't take a position because it protects you and then reverse it because now you can start oppressing other folks with your religious views. But again, it didn't really matter that much. The really convenient thing is that the Christian right shared Ronald Reagan's anti-communism. And in fact, lots of times in that era, when folks talked rhetorically about communism, it was godless communism, okay? And so for the Christian right, the real problem with communist regimes wasn't that they would take over the economy, it's that they wouldn't let you practice your religion, okay? Those two developments in different ways made the Republican Party much more ideological than it had been in the past. The free market approach, because he went off with folks who really weren't respected as economists and really hadn't done solid research to demonstrate the validity of their theory. Well, now you're taking things because you believe in the principles that are there. So you believe in reducing the role of government in the economy, and you believe that folks on the demand side of the equation are leeching resources from the government, this becomes the welfare cheats kind of rhetoric that you get in the 1980s. But on the other hand, those solid, virtuous citizens that own companies, those are the folks that drive the economy. In other words, it's based more on ideas than evidence. And it's tied to values. Okay, I'm going to come back to that notion of values because it's crucial to seeing why this kind of moves in that direction. It's even easier to see that if the Christian right moves in, then values are at the heart of what, we're going to value life and oppose abortion, right? And in fact, there was a focus on abortion that didn't exist before. Again, I understand in your lifetimes, you haven't experienced a time, but really, prior to 1980, the issue of abortion was dealt with in more material, not symbolic terms. Here's how. Abortion became an issue because doctors wanted to make sure that they could perform various procedures and not risk prosecution. So who's involved? It's doctors talking about the sort of technical information about pregnancy and abortion. Okay? There was none of what you guys take for granted in the abortion debate. It doesn't get this emotional until the Christian right pulls into town with Ronald Reagan. Okay? Okay, so values from both of those sources, right? Values from the free market folks, values from the Christian right. You don't compromise values. This is a key insight from Chuck Lindblom that I may have identified by name or may have just put this forward. You get from Lindblom's approach that endorses incrementalism, you make good policy by taking a look at existing policy, gathering evidence about it, and then tinkering with it to make it a little bit better. And that if you instead focus on, we want our political system to pursue these values, there's no room for compromise. Then you have the equivalent of civil war because you have some folks who embrace the value, other folks who reject the value, or support a different conflicting value. Okay, it's Chuck Lindblom's like nightmare. As soon as policymaking gets tied that closely to values, this is a recipe for what we witness now. Okay. So in part, I'm asking you to imagine a world without that. And that really was the world that led to that old model of policymaking. Okay? All those outside actors think about things generally. Well, that's an invitation to think about values. Okay? All the folks in the sub-governmental system have narrow perspectives. If you have a narrow perspective, you're not looking at big values. Okay? So already you can kind of, I'm inviting you to start thinking about looking forward. You can think about, oh, this is why we're getting these kinds of changes in the policymaking process. Okay? This doesn't happen overnight, though. As part of tonight's history lesson, you don't see this happening overnight. And in fact, you see even the Democrats supporting Ronald Reagan a fair amount. The Democratic Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill, works fairly cordially with Ronald Reagan. They even give him, an anecdotal thing and then a general measure, okay? The anecdotal thing is, you've got Democratic control of the House and you still get these non-incremental tax cuts in 1981 and 1986. You don't do that without getting some support from Democratic members of the House and the Senate. Well, he gets it. Again, you can't imagine that happening now. And it's not just that he gets a tax cut supported by the other party. He gets a non-incremental tax cut. This wasn't a little minor change. These were like 26% across the board tax cuts, okay? Huge. But you did not have the kind of partisan polarization we see now. And so, you could get that kind of negotiation going back and forth between Ronald Reagan and Democrats in the House and in the Senate, okay? One general measure is that virtually every president has a honeymoon period. There are a couple that either didn't or shouldn't have, but it generally, it's there. The first year of your administration, you're just elected. Both parties, your own party certainly is thrilled to have somebody in the White House. And the other party is sort of deferring to you because you won a presidential election. I looked up his presidential support score in the first year of his first term, 1981. Across the two parties, he had an 82% presidential support score. 82%. And you're talking about, in the House, Democrats held 56% of the seats. Got it? That, again, imagine now one of the parties holding 56% of the seats of a body. The opposing party holds the president. They're never going to get an 82% presidential support score in the institution. Mathematically, it's just not going to happen. And in succeeding years, presidential support score declined a little bit, but just modestly, about what you would expect if you look at previous administrations. It's what it normally does, okay? Presidential approval drops over the course of his term. Presidential support drops through the course of the term. Nothing out of the ordinary, okay? So you don't have all the things that we now take for granted. It's just the seeds of that at this point. And that just kind of sets the stage for what happens as the Reagan administration moves on. And I think I just want to do like the formation, the early formation of that coalition right now. And then next time, take a look at the Reagan administration, both terms, and how these processes began to accelerate. But it's probably a good place to stop right now. We got about an hour under our belt. Anything that you guys want to toss in right now? And I really welcome it because I'm interested in kind of ideas you have about things you'd like me to hit about the Reagan administration next class. What's occurring to you at this point?
Well, I had a general question. It's
Sure.
not really a concept for class, but is it Reagan's getting the credit for this change, but was it really Reagan, or was there a strategist behind him, like a David Axelrod, Karl Rove type strategist that was in his administration driving this? Or is it him as an individual that had these ideologies, happened to be elected, could change a party?
Yeah. And that's a good question, particularly because you have a different sort of example in the White House right now. Okay, Ronald Reagan he didn't have much of a grip on knowledge about policy or any. I mean, he'd been like, he was a spokesman for General Electric. He thought in terms of movies. I mean, I was just listening to, there was a book just published, Fred Kaplan, I think, about, and it's about sort of the history of nuclear war or nuclear armament. And he recounts, this is actually one of the books I used for the course on Reagan. He recounts this seminal meeting that Ronald Reagan had with Gorbachev. They start out and it's really, really tense. And Reagan's just kind of dogmatic about his anti-communism, and he's just hammering this stuff. Again, values are driving him. Values don't require smart. you hold your values, you know, and you talk about them emotionally and fervently. And then they take a break. I think they had coffee or something, and it was then just them and the translator. And it occurs to Reagan to think about a movie that he loved, The Day the Earth Stood Still. It's one of Reagan's favorite movies. And it's about aliens attacking the world. And it's hard. I can't imagine I could have been Mikhail Gorbachev and experienced this with a straight face, but he turns to Gorbachev and he says, if aliens invaded and attacked the United States, would you defend us? And Gorbachev, for whatever reason, in a heartfelt way says, of course we would. And Reagan turns back to him, and we would feel the same way toward you. And then they started negotiating a little more effectively. But like, are you kidding me? That's not one of the finest minds of the 20th century right there. But he had a lot of support behind him. You had lots of folks in the Republican Party who had plenty of experience, who were really, really smart, incredibly effective at putting these things into effect. So it's the difference between intuition, and I'm even giving Reagan more credit than maybe he deserves there, but it was just who he was, and he just was who he was, and he had those beliefs, and so he just, you know, ran with them. But in terms of executing things, and you know, he had some good speechwriters, so there were a number of people who became famous as his speechwriters, who helped. So he had kind of this vision, but you're right, he had all of this talent behind him who could write those speeches, who could think strategically about building majorities in Congress, who could do the heavy lifting that's required in actually assembling a presidential program in policy terms. You know, I'm going to go, unlike what you see with Trump. Trump doesn't have anybody who knows how to do that. But Reagan had plenty of folks in the Republican Party. They were sharp, they were articulate, they were politically savvy, and they could do the behind the scenes heavy lifting to get that done, to make it an enduring part of what constituted the Republican Party, and to make big changes in public policy. Yeah. And you know, I think in terms of negotiations with Congress, the fact that he was just sort of a jovial kind of guy. He could get along personally with, like, he had a nice warm relationship with Tip O'Neill, Democratic Speaker of the House. Basic social skills. Does that get it? The kinds of things you were.
Right. And I think that I would add to that, from what I hear, because I'm not going to make you feel old. I was born in 1983.
Oh, go ahead.
But from what I hear from folks around that time that were more active in politics, that even the world was different in the sense that there was respect for the office, respect for the position, that carried through. So even if you disagreed with the individual or disagreed with the policy or the values, you still said, Mr. President, you still said, Mr. Speaker, you still had, especially in the Senate, as you had referenced in the last session, this institutional respect that maybe doesn't necessarily exist today.
No, I mean, the partisan polarization then makes that less relevant, right? Why should I respect you if I think the values that you espouse are evil? You know, you've lost the ability to have any kind of comity where folks get along with one another, and you've lost the ability then to negotiate and compromise. You've lost respect for folks on the other side. It's you just don't have a chance then. You just don't.
Hey, Pat, I'm wondering, you know, Reagan obviously had the benefit of a very strong economy when he was in office, at least towards his second term, right? I'm just wondering what the effect of a good economy has on, you know, the role of support, the amount of support.
Yeah.
Exactly, because I think that has a lot to do with it, right? I mean, you're going to support whoever, if you feel like your life is getting better, you know.
And even, yes, I'll give the initial yes, and then say, but even that becomes eroded with partisan polarization. Okay, so one of the things that political scientists are studying right now involves how partisanship now affects the way that people perceive the economy, and you get really big differences in the way that Democrats and Republicans will evaluate the same economic phenomenon that's occurring at a given time. So even that gets weaker with partisan polarization. Yeah, but like earlier, yeah, absolutely. And it's one of the things that erodes Jimmy Carter's support, is the economy just tanks, like in unprecedented kind of ways, and also with really visible kinds of consequences. I mean, I was in graduate school, and there was an oil embargo, and so you check and you go, okay, it's an even day, I can go get gas today, and you'd go down to the gas station, and there would be a line that would stretch for blocks because of that gas shortage. So those easy to understand kinds of things, and the devastating nature of the economy, that really hurt Jimmy Carter a lot. Yeah. Other stuff?
You'd find it interesting to know, during a happy hour the other week, I was talking about this class, and some of my fellow associates who've gone through a lot of schooling, right? We were talking, and they go, well, I think politics should be emotional. Like you should be voting on values and different stuff. I'm like, oh my God. So I thought you would get a laugh out of that. Because I was talking about, like, I don't care if they share Spotify lists or book lists. Like, to me, that's not their job, you know? And they're like, it makes them human. And I'm like, oh God.
Well, Hannah, let me sort of out myself here. Certainly, you know, when I was teaching the little freshman bunnies class, little issues class, and a bunch of, there were at least some folks who took it. For most of the time, I said, I kind of want you to care about this stuff. And part of that is emotional. But then I get to be the adult in the room. So I think it's, you know, in that classroom situation, I wanted liberals and conservatives to argue with one another. I wanted Democrats and Republicans to argue with one another. And my job in that situation was to then be the adult in the room. And when folks didn't have evidence or didn't have an argument, to point that out in the nicest, gentlest way that I possibly could. You want people to care about these things, and that's an emotion, right? It's just, if that's all that's there and the emotion has gone through the roof, then you've created an explosive situation. You know,
So you're kind of talking about the celebrity of politics and politicians.
Mhm.
And this is not quite a tangent, but even just my like, oh, I don't think, you know, I don't care if they put out a Spotify list, like that's not relevant to me, whatever. It turned into this huge, heated, emotional debate. And I was like, oh gosh, we can't even talk about a Spotify playlist. So
Yeah. Sadness. Yeah. You know, first it's masks, and now it's Spotify lists. It's just there's seemingly no end.
Well, I thought it used to be, would I want to have a beer with them? You know.
Ah.
Yeah, remember that one?
Yes.
Is, you know, if I could sit down and have a beer with them, I think I like them.
Yeah. Another one, and this isn't that long ago. Do you remember date night? For the State of the Union address, they decided they were going to have date night. So, you know, if you're a Republican, you were supposed to find a Democrat to sit next to for the State of the Union address. And it was, oh, that's cute. That's cute. But
Oh, now I'm like, I tell now I'm like, tomorrow's debate night or tomorrow's the State of the Union, we will not be getting together. Like, I don't want those people in my house because I want to be able to speak freely, yell at the TV, rant to my husband who give to whatever about what I'm looking and listening to. So,
yeah. And you know, all of that social stuff that formed this social cement in Washington, D.C. It's the opposite of the way that social media works, right? One of the reasons that people can say such horrible things on social media is that you're not standing there in front of them. If you put distance between folks, it's easier for them to be inhuman and just ignore your humanity, okay? But for generations, members of Congress had friendships across the aisle. And when you look at the early retirements of those folks, and you take a look at what they said when they were leaving, they would often comment on that lack of comity. You know, I did the line about the Democratic Party as I know it is dead, and you have moved it. Well, the House as I knew it is dead. The Senate as I know it is dead. It's not the same institution, and I don't like this. I don't like being at war with my colleagues. I like being able to have conversations with them. a standard legislative strategy involved a member of one party thinking creatively about what sort of policy they might author, what sort of bill they might author with a member of the other party. Because then that was a pretty good recipe for getting your stuff passed. If you had bill sponsorship by members of the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, you could be successful. And think about the payoff. This means we can pass policy that satisfies citizens. Something concrete, okay? That's not nearly, it's certainly not done very much, and it's not done on particularly important legislation very much at all. Instead, it's about staking out the sort of ideological position. Once again, it's not as much as in the past focused on concrete accomplishments in terms of public policy. Instead, there's more of a direction toward the next election. Again, focus on campaigns and elections rather than policy making. And you know what? I think at this point, there are large numbers of folks in the House and the Senate that don't even realize that's what they're doing. They're on automatic pilot. They just do it because everybody's doing it. There's not even the sort of meditative, thoughtful, why am I doing this? It's just, no, this is what we as Democrats do. This is what we as Republicans do. Yeah, I just saw Leslie's things that, like, Joe Biden is one of those dinosaurs who has, a history of working with Republicans and getting along just fine.
But is the partisanship so strong that he won't be able to do it despite his history and experience doing it? I mean, is his personality big enough to overcome that, the partisanship that we
I don't think
have?
So. I wouldn't bet on it. I mean, well, in later sections, I'm going to go, there have been opportunities to put a dent in this. There have been at least a couple opportunities. And
like on infrastructure or something that everybody kind of thought they agreed on?
I'm going to hold you all in suspense. No, in terms of the president of one party reaching out to congressional members of the other party and getting their hand bit instead of trying to do something to end that polarization. Yeah, and bit pretty hard too. So it's hard for me to see that. I think there's got to be some party transformation, and it's probably going to, I mean, everything is coming down to elections now, okay? There have to be consequences from some elections that put a high price on this sort of behavior, on the party behaving in that kind of way, in the party being that ideological. It's just, it's hard for me to see that, in the future right now. And I wouldn't be, I mean, if Biden gets elected, I wouldn't be terribly surprised if he just did one term.
Well, the pundits on TV just, actually, you know what, I'll wait till we stop recording. I don't want to, I want to hold it, Because then they're going to come back 30 years later and say, Michelle, in 2020, you said. Anyway, I think this is a good, does anybody have any closing comments? We're going to turn off the recording. Everybody good? All right. Awesome, Pat. Thanks so
Okay.
much. All right.
All right. By the way,
Yeah.
next week I will be broadcasting from New Jersey. We're visiting my sisters and brother-in-law in Millburn, New Jersey. So we'll see. Maybe I get nastier when I go to New Jersey and